Alors, notre prochain conférencier, Christopher Reigeluth, est candidat au doctorat en psychologie clinique à l'Université Clark et est un fellow en traumatisme du Centre d'études sur les enfants de l'Université Yale. Après l'obtention de son baccalauréat en psychologie, il a travaillé à Boston avec plusieurs organisations œuvrant en santé internationale, en mentorat auprès des jeunes et en santé mentale à l'hôpital McLean. Au cours des 6 dernières années, il a également été membre du Men's Wellbeing Research Group, où il a mis en place et contribué à des études sur les expériences des garçons et des hommes avec les politiques de genre, le silence émotionnel et l'invisibilité et les obstacles à la recherche de soins de santé mentale. Il termine actuellement sa thèse de doctorat sur la socialisation des sexes chez les garçons adolescents et les conséquences sur le bien-être. M. Reigeluth a publié des articles relatifs à ces thèmes et à d'autres liés au bien-être psychologique des garçons et des hommes. Et il a déclaré ne pas avoir de conflit d'intérêt ni d'apparence de conflit d'intérêt. On va redescendre l'écran. On me fait signe 1 minute. Personne qui a touché à rien. Bon, j'imagine qu'est-ce qui se passe. Yeah. Descendre écran. Bon, c'est bon. Le sort s'acharne contre nous. C'est correct? Je touche à rien. On s'occupe de nous, on s'occupe de nous. Mr. Reigeluth, welcome.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Chris. So I took French in high school, and that's about what I remember at this point. So my presentation will be in English, unfortunately, but very nice to be here and talking about this really important topic and, thinking about it in the larger scale in relation to boys and men and eating disorders and body dissatisfaction. But also thinking about it with this presentation in the larger scale of men's mental health care and barriers to men's mental health care, which is a really important topic. And it's one that I think really doesn't get enough attention in lots of countries and lots of different countries. So really nice that we're making time for this today and hopefully can find ways to carry it forward into our communities and in the work that we do. So I wanted to just start with a quote that I think really sums up kind of what I'm going to be talking about today and hopefully what we'll be discussing, which comes from Michael Kaufman's book, Men's Contradictory Experience of Power. And in it he says, there are many things men do to have the type of power we associate with masculinity, which we'll be talking a lot about. We've got to perform and stay in control. We've got to conquer, be on top of things, and call the shots. We've got to tough it out, provide and achieve. Meanwhile, we learn to beat back our feelings, hide our emotions, and suppress our needs. And I think that's one of the major barriers that we'll be discussing in relation to boys and men's mental health care, is that in order to meet society's expectations for what qualifies as a competent, capable, empowered male, you have to hide and suppress all of the things that when a boy or man comes to therapy, he's asked not to suppress, and he's asked to reveal, and he's asked to be vulnerable. So these things really fly in the face of one another and create a lot of difficulties for boys and men who are struggling when they do need to get help. So this really kind of leads to the fundamental overarching question that I think is relevant to many of the presentations today, which is, how can men as a group at the top really be so privileged and have lots of power, and in most cases the most power in society, which is a problem, and yet have so much difficulty taking care of themselves with regard to physical and mental health. And today we'll be talking about the mental health piece, but across the board, across different disorders, physical health conditions, men go to the doctor less, they take not very good care of themselves, they die earlier, they have more physical health problems, they have more substance abuse problems. Eating disorders are something that we really need to learn a lot more about. So we have this contradiction in this very empowered group in society that yet is really struggling when it comes to mental and physical health. So I hope we can be thinking about that more, and as we get to the discussion later, really talking about what might be going on there. So these are the 3 learning objectives that I'm going to be on today. The first and really kind of the main focus of the talk is what are the primary barriers to mental health care that men experience. We're going to be talking a lot about emotional silence and invisibility, which is one of the main areas of focus in the research group that I'm involved with at Clark. So what are the barriers? What do they look like? We're going to kind of then go into, so where do these barriers come from? Are they always here? Does society kind of create them? What sustains them? And then we're going to end with, so with these barriers and these causes to these barriers, what does that mean for boys and men? What does it mean for mental health? What does it mean for men's eating disorders and all of those things? So that's kind of where I'll be ending. Even though the title of the talk is Men's Psychological Barriers to Mental Health Care, I will be talking a bit about boys, which is where my area of research is, in adolescence, because that's really where this starts. These problems don't start in manhood when, a boy crosses over to 18 or whatever the age is. They start very early. And boys start getting messages early that create to some of these problems that we're starting to see later in life for men. Okay, so this is the first one. This is the first objective. So what are the primary barriers? And this is really trying to get at what gets in the way of help seeking and what gets in the way of boys and men receiving services that we know they need. And then what are some of the ways that we can recognize when this is going on? When a barrier is starting to get erected, or when there's some resistance in place for a boy or man, how can we recognize and see that, and what does it look like? So the primary barrier is, and I just want people to take a moment to think for yourselves, kind of before I put out what I think the primary barrier to boys and men receiving mental health care, just think for yourselves for a moment what it could be. Okay, and I'm not going to ask you to say it, but just hold it in your head, and this is my sense of kind of what the primary barrier is, and a lot of researchers have looked at masculinity. It's a big word, I think it's a word that when it gets put out there starts to bring things up. It starts to bring up different words. It has different meanings for different people. But what are some of the words that come to mind when you just see that in big, bold print on the screen? Can anyone shout anything out? Muscles. It definitely means muscles. Does it just mean muscles? Power. Self-reliance. Work.
Care for your children.
Yeah, being a provider, care for your children, for your family, absolutely. Solidarity, yep. So these are really great examples, and we're in Canada now, right? So I usually do this in the US, and my American students say very similar things. So they'll talk about words like being a player, sexual success, having lots of sex, power, being stoic, not showing a lot of emotions, strong, invincible, in control, dominance, provider, which the gentleman up there mentioned. I think those are the ones that I wanted to highlight. And so, you know, talking about masculinity is interesting because we're kind of defining what the ideal, kind of the societal ideal is. And so if we went around to different men or different people in the room and asked you, you know, do you embody all of these things, or do the men in your life or the boys in your life embody all of these things? Typically they don't. But, you know, the problem with how we define masculinity in this kind of idealized dominant form is that there's nothing up here about being emotional or being vulnerable or communicating intimately, which as we know from lots of research that's been done, those are really important just human needs. And they're things that all people can do, but men unfortunately get the message very early on that those types of things aren't appropriate for being, you know, the ideal form of man. And that's what society teaches us, which can really, you know, as I see it, be the primary barrier to mental health care. And really, you know, is, you know, a main opposing force to trying to get a man to seek help. And to take this a step, we forgot tough. To take this a step further, what really comes from, you know, these dominant conceptions of masculinity is emotional silence and invisibility. And so that's an additional barrier. It's also part of masculinity. It comes from it. And this is what we look at a lot in our research group. And I'm going to define that for you shortly. But essentially, it's the mechanism through which many boys resist or are ambivalent about making themselves vulnerable about receiving help. And an image that we use to kind of represent emotional silence and invisibility is the invisible man, who has a nice suit on. He has this empowered stance, but you really have no sense of what is going on for him underneath the surface, what he's feeling. He, you know, is presenting a facade that everything is okay, but it's really hard to know a lot of the times if everything is okay, because he isn't making himself vocal. He isn't kind of talking about feelings and stuff, because that's how he's been socialized. So appearing confident, appearing stoic, right, polished and unwrinkled on the outside, but not really sure what's going on the inside. So what do we mean by the silence and invisibility? Right? So this is a metaphor that we use for the range of ways that boys' and men's pain remains hidden, but it's also a very tangible thing that we can see and observe, right? So silence is not sharing or divulging distress when it's there. It's either choosing actively to keep it to yourself or unknowingly keeping it to yourself, or sometimes having problems that you really don't know about or don't understand, or feelings that are confusing for yourself. And then invisibility really comes from silence. It's when pain and suffering goes unrecognized. It's when someone is having a lot of difficulties in their life, at work, in relationships, with an eating disorder, with lots of things, but aren't able to communicate and reach out to other people. And so they're holding on to all of that by themselves, and the caretakers, the loved ones in their lives, don't know what's going on. So. Some of the popular images that certainly apply to a US context, and I'll kind of be curious if they also apply to a Canadian context, is Grumpy Uncle Charlie. So it's that grandfather, it's that uncle who's kind of in the corner of the room, and he grumbles at people, and he's pretty gruff, doesn't show a lot of compassion, doesn't show a lot of warmth, but there's something endearing about him. There's something likable and amusing about him, but it's a little bit confusing because he's kind of gruff and grumpy all the time. So this would be an example of what we would think of as a silent and invisible man. You just don't know what's going on with Grumpy Uncle Charlie. And then we've got more of kind of the adolescent boy example, which is Solemn Sam. So it's that boy who doesn't say a lot. He kind of looks sad. You'll ask him how his day was, and he might say fine, and then go up to his bedroom. Really keeps to himself. You can tell that something's bothering him, right? And this is a boy who's already gotten the message as a man in this society, it's important for me to figure this out on my own, because if I go to other people for help, it's going to be a problem. And then the last one is Positive Pete. And Positive Pete is the guy who everything is always going well for. He doesn't have a bad day. You might ask him, how are you doing? And he responds with, can't complain, couldn't be better. So he's kind of really embodying that, for me to be doing well, other people need to think I'm doing well all the time. And so, as soon as you put out there, how are you doing, you just get back all of these affirmatives, but you never really feel like you have a sense of knowing him and kind of knowing what's going on for him. And I think as clinicians, as mental health workers, as people who work with men, this can be the most difficult one to decipher, because on the surface, he's putting out a lot of positive energy, a lot of affirmative stuff, when kind of inside things could really be tumultuous and painful. Whereas with the other two examples, you can kind of tell that something's going on for them. With this type of guy, it's going to be more difficult. So. I also want to just put out there, when we talk about masculinity, it's easy to get overgeneralizable. And it's easy to kind of hear a presentation like this and think, well, this stuff doesn't apply to me. Whether you're a man or however you identify. I identify my emotions. I talk to my partner about this. I go see a therapist. And so we're really talking about kind of men as a group here. And so there's lots of variation with boys and men as a group. And so we're really talking about as a group in general, and in these dominant forms, these norms can create problems for lots of boys and men, but not for all boys and men. So important to keep that in mind. Okay, so when we think more about, right, this barrier of emotional silence and invisibility that comes from masculinity and dominant masculine norms, there are three types that we look at. There's private, there's personal, and there's public. So this is three ways that it can manifest. Private silence and invisibility is when you know something is going on inside. When a boy or a man knows something is going on that is not feeling right, that's not working well for him, and he chooses not to share it with another person or with the people close to him. He chooses to keep it to himself. Personal is when things aren't going well for that boy or that man in terms of mental health, in terms of physical health, in terms of other stuff, and he doesn't really know. He can kind of sense that something's wrong, but he's having a difficult time figuring out the emotions, figuring out what it is. One term that has gotten kind of used for this type of thing is alexithymia, and there's been some research done on normative male alexithymia, which is having difficulty identifying or describing emotions. And it can happen to both boys and men and women and girls and all people, but in this case we're thinking about boys and men. And then public silence and invisibility is when a boy or a man makes an effort to put himself out there and he gets shut down. He gets told to suck it up. He gets told to man up. I'm not sure how you would say that in French, but those are the types of messages that he gets. He gets told it's not okay for you to be making yourself vulnerable like this, and you need to stop that. So that's really kind of the public response. And all three can operate in conjunction at times. Sometimes one is more prevalent than the other, but these are really the kind of three main types of emotional silence and invisibility that make it very difficult for lots of boys and men to seek mental health care services, to go to providers, to get support when they need it. So I want to just quickly give 3 examples to show, how this could manifest in a clinic. So personal silence might be, right, so the therapist is asking, how do you feel about your recent divorce? And the client says, I don't know, it shouldn't have happened. So a very direct acknowledgement of, I don't know how I'm feeling, I'm having a hard time figuring it out. Private would be the therapist asking, how do you feel about your recent divorce? I haven't been sleeping or eating well for the past 3 months, really difficult to work, constantly thinking about my children. Have you told anyone about this? No, I haven't mentioned it to anyone, even my closest friends. Another example that just is jumping into my head right now is the case of a man who lost his job, who I heard about, that another clinician friend was working with, and he started going to coffee shops during the day because he was so ashamed of going home and letting his family know that he had lost his job. And then public would be, how do you feel about your recent divorce? Right? The therapist asked that. I can't complain. I started talking about it with a male friend recently, and he told me to suck it up, and the quicker I get over it, the better. So these are how these things can manifest in real life. These are really more clinical examples, but coming from a boy or man's experience with the real world in different ways. And we do work at Clark and in the men's well-being research group where we talk to boys and men about this stuff, and we try to understand it more. So I want to show you one example, and don't start reading it yet, but what happened is this was from the Visible Men Project, which was a research project that we did where we invited men into our office to talk with us about a difficult life event that they had gone through. And we were very clear for them it was not a therapy thing. We weren't going to be offering them any treatment, although we were a little sneaky because just talking, right, is a form of therapy. But we really made it clear this is just for you to get out whatever you want to get out. It's an open, safe space where, as a man, you can talk about something difficult. So this quote comes from a 57-year-old firefighter. And earlier in kind of the day when he was describing this event to us, he had been out on firefighting duty, and he got to a firefighting scene that was really kind of intense, and bad things had happened to people. And one of the bad things that had happened was a little baby had died, and the little baby was kind of there in the building, and he found her. And he used a really intense descriptor when he was talking about coming across this baby, which I don't want to make people uncomfortable, but sometimes it's a part of our work, which he described her as a piece of burned meat. And it wasn't in a derogatory or negative way, but it was just how she appeared. She was in such rough shape. And his initial impulse was he wanted to cover her up. He wanted to get her out of the building. And he was told by his chief, no, you have to leave her here. You know, forensics and other investigation services have to come. So an hour went by, another hour went by. He's getting more and more upset that this baby isn't being kind of treated more respectfully. The services eventually come kind of way too late. And, you know, he's feeling like the baby is just, this dead baby is just getting more and more kind of disrespected by the environment, and it was really upsetting for him. So he kind of then went home, and this is what happened when he tried to share the experience with his wife, which was, I can remember going home that day, right, from that street that the fire was on. It was the first time my oldest daughter, well, I guess you might have called it, walked across the room and came to the door and greeted me. I was a puddle, right? So that's a very vivid descriptor to kind of describe his emotional world at that time. My wife said to me, "What's your problem?" I said, "I just had a bad day. I'm going upstairs to lie down." Right? So that would be kind of an example of private if it ended there, right? He's not going to divulge it. He's just going to go upstairs and try to deal with it on his own. Then she said, "Oh, sure, I got supper on the table here, and you're going to go lay down." I said, "So what are we eating?" She said, "Roast beef." I puked because that was the vision I saw with the babies, right? And then I, as the interviewer, said, right. And then the participant said, "Well, so I tell her what happened. She goes, 'You know, I deal with death every day.'" She's a nurse, right? So he's a firefighter. He had this really upsetting experience. He takes it home to his wife, tries to share it with her, and he gets shut down. So that's an example of public silence and invisibility. And then one more that I want to share with you is from an adolescent boy. And this is from research that I've done. And it was a research study that I did where I interviewed 14 to 19-year-olds about a social process that we'll be talking about in a little bit called policing of masculinity. And boys would kind of tell me different things, different ways of that they tease other boys, how it feels in different ways. And this was one example of a boy who had a really painful experience with this type of teasing called policing of masculinity. And so he's describing the situation to me of, right, so he was talking to his friend, it was about a year ago. My friend, because I was just like depressed all the time, my friend called me a depressed little bitch. And like it just really got to me because I just lost my grandfather. So his grandfather had died, he was feeling sad. And stuff like that just started getting to me. Did that cause you to feel like you needed to change how you were feeling, how you presented to people? And then he says, yeah, because when he said that to me, like I learned to hide how I was feeling. Like I would put on a fake smile, right? So this happens to boys, it happens to men, and typically it's a result of something in their social environment. And in this case, it's a boy that he refers to as his friend, who he's feeling depressed, he lost his and his friend lets him know, right? Well, the slide's still here, so that's good. His friend lets him know right away, that's not appropriate. You can't do that. You can't put yourself out there. And as a result, he really changes how he's presenting to other people and puts up this fake facade, which is people who care about mental health or mental health caregivers is not a good thing, as we know, and typically leads to further problems down the road. In addition to silence and invisibility and just dominant masculine gender norms, there are other barriers to mental health care, right? As a society, we're, at least in the US, and I would guess in Canada too, we're pretty stigmatizing towards mental health treatment. It's something that people oftentimes feel like they have to do a little bit more in secret. You can be more open about going to your primary caretaker, but you can't be as open about going to a therapist. There just aren't as many facilities across the world for mental health care. We don't run into that problem as much in the US and Canada, although there certainly aren't as many mental health care facilities as there are primary health care facilities. But you get outside of Western countries, a lot of countries in Africa, other parts of the world, I mean, you need to find a therapist or a psychologist. The concept just really doesn't exist in a lot of ways and continues to be very stigmatized. And right when we talk about boys and men's eating disorders, even in the US and Canada and lots of Western countries, I mean, there's a tremendous lack of resources and knowledge about how these things are manifesting. Insurance company reimbursement practices can make mental health care delivery really onerous, both for clinicians and for the patient, so that can be a barrier to care. And in general, there are more women's health and mental health focused kind of centers, infrastructure, than there are men's, although I think ProfIL and the initiative that's going on here is a really great response to that, and trying to get out more empirically supported information about men's mental health and eating disorders on websites, through videos, through platforms that can be shared with the public. So this is a really wonderful response to that, which is very positive. Okay, so moving on to objective 2. I'm noticing I'm going to have to start moving a little bit more quickly. So where do these barriers come from? Right? Is this innate? Is this biological? Are boys and men born this way? We really don't think so, and as researchers, that's really not what we've learned. We've learned that, for the most part, it comes from societies, and it comes from how societies define what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and kind of the expectations of those roles, which we call socialization. And so here we're really going to explore, so how does this stuff get so entrenched? How does it come about? And there are really 3 main processes that I'm going to be looking at. One is gendered social learning, right? So a very simple form of that is just modeling that parents can do with their kids. It's modeling that friends can do with peers. Sometimes it's just a direct social message to another person that takes the form of socialization. We'll talk about masculine norm enforcement, which was the policing of masculinity stuff that I mentioned. And then media and popular press, dominant forms of media, movies, music, magazines, all sorts of platforms really help to kind of reinforce these dominant notions of masculinity and contribute to kind of these barriers that we were just talking about. Okay, so social learning, many examples come to mind, and you can maybe think for yourself if anything comes to mind of how you learned about what it means to be a man or a woman or some other way of identifying, right? Because there are lots of ways. One way that a boy could learn about what it means to be a man is from a father. And some boys have fathers, and we hear about this in our research. We hear about it when we're interviewing boys and men, but a lot of times men will reflect back on having fathers who were really tough and gruff, didn't show a lot of emotions themselves, and as a result, they felt like they had to mimic that as they were getting older. And then another kind of really, I think pretty widespread example of the socialization stuff that happens is you have a crying boy, and in America, a common example is, honey, big boys don't cry. Do parents say that to their kids in Canada? How would you say that in French? Does that get said in French? Okay, so I'm seeing a head nod up here. And then, and research has shown this, and then when the daughter is upset, a lot of parents will give her more room to express herself. So the son gets shut down, whereas the daughter's given more space, and this is something that empirical research has shown across lots of different studies, that parents will really, in a lot of cases, unknowingly have a very different response to their 2 gendered children. Okay, so this gets into policing of masculinity, which is any action that's intended to prevent or punish behaviors perceived as insufficiently masculine. It happens between boys, it happens between men, it happens between men and boys, it happens between kind of across all different groups. Right, so any action intended to prevent or punish behavior perceived as insufficiently masculine. So someone is perceiving that there's a gender deviation taking place, and they're telling that boy, you need to change. That's not appropriate. You need to do something differently than you are right now. And so a common example could be one boy's looking a little glum in school. Another boy comes along and says, hey, pussy, why are you crying? Intense language, and I'm not sure what the words would be in French, but in the US, it's a lot of misogynistic, so anti-female, homophobic words. Sometimes it's more direct in terms of just man up, be a man. And we find that these types of words and messages are used across lots of different cultures, but it's kind of the misogynistic, homophobic, those groups over there, we're trying to distance ourselves from them, and it's an empowerment thing that happens. So policing of masculinity is a big part of where it happens, and it's a big contributor to men's emotional silence and invisibility. Now, these behaviors, we found typically peak in high school. So boys actually start this stuff pretty young. As boys are learning to be gendered, as they're kind of learning to be different from girls, as they're starting to pair off, they start to do this stuff. I mean, I've seen studies as early as kindergarten, first grade, where researchers are documenting this. But it really seems to peak in high school, which is kind of all about the gender intensification hypothesis, which people have maybe heard about, which as boys and girls are going through puberty and are physically starting to change, the kind of gender differences become even more magnified. And so as a result, this process gets even more amplified. And then once boys kind of get through high school and later stages and are becoming men, it dies down a little bit, but it doesn't stop. Men continue to do this stuff as well. And one example might be in the scenario on the left, a guy talking about relationship difficulties. And maybe his marriage just came apart or something happened that felt bad, and his friend's response is, dude, you've got to move on and get over her. On the surface, it seems kind of normal and maybe like not a big deal, but these more kind of routine, normal ways that it happens, the less victimizing ways where you're with friends, I think are the ones that have a more profound influence on boys and men. Another kind of silly example, but I think this happens, is a bunch of guys out on the golf course, a guy hits a bad shot, and his friend says, hey, Jim, take off your skirt and swing like a man. So these guys are being playful with one another. There's probably lots of laughter in a moment like this, but the underlying message of there's something wrong with that other group over there of girls and women, and we are not like them, gets reinforced through these types of things when they come up. And then really the other social learning kind of platform that gets used a lot is movies. So these are just some examples of kind of the stoic quiet man. It's okay to be a quiet man. Old School, if anyone's seen that one, guys just kind of acting like buffoons. The Hangover, kind of all popular media forms, guys as, the superheroes or just these, incredibly kind of violent, glorified personifications, American Pie, and then just as kind of blatant as think like a man, right? Because there's a way to think like a man, apparently. And then magazines. So this is a search that I did recently. I did a men's health search. And this was for a lecture that I was giving in a class. And I was like, I wonder what will come up when I put in men's health. And this is what came up. Abs, abs, and abs. I mean, it's unbelievable. I challenge you all to do a Google search on this. It literally seems like every men's health cover is on ripped abs, right? But it's not on health issues. It's not on mental health issues. It doesn't cover men's eating disorders, as far as I know, right? And in the US, at least, this is the most popular platform we have. I'd be curious to know what the Canadian equivalent is. So when it comes to the real issues that boys and men faced in the popular formats, they have a really hard time gaining a voice, and they have a really hard time finding representation. But when it comes to messages about kind of sex, dominance, power, having ripped bodies, there's a lot more reinforcement that's happening, and it's out there in very popularized, powerful, impressionable ways. Gets into toys that kids play with, video games, commercials. And as a society, we sometimes directly mock men who seek mental health treatment. And I'm just going to pull up a commercial, which I'm not sure if it's aired in Canada, but it aired a while in the US, and I think it's a pretty good representation of this. So this is a car commercial, or car insurance.
Could switching to Geico really save you 15% or more on car insurance? Does a former drill sergeant make a terrible therapist?
And that's why yellow makes me sad, I think.
That's interesting. You know what makes me sad?
You do! Maybe we should chug on over to Mamby-Pamby land, where maybe we can find some self-confidence for you, you jackwagon!
Tissue? Cry, baby.
Geico. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
Okay. Has anyone, did that commercial get played at all? I mean, do you guys have Geico
After
in the
all
U.S.
my
or
time as a Marine Corps
do you have
soldier,
commercials?
I felt that I was ready for a
Do you have commercials like that?
something calm, quiet, peaceful, like a library. 3 months overdue.
Okay, hopefully that'll do it. Right, so it's out there in the media. It is, what did I do with my clicker? In these very popularized formats, these are just some examples, but I challenge you to think for your kind of own cultures here in Montreal and across Canada and other parts, if this stuff is happening too, how these messages are getting out there and really creating these barriers for boys' mental health care, and my guess is that they are. Okay, and then this gets into our last objective, and I'm going to go a little bit more quickly here because there's a final video clip that I really want to show you of a kind of documentary initiative that's been done in the US to try to get the message out there more about this problem. So this gets into the consequences of silence and invisibility, of boys and men not being able to get access to the mental health care they need. And the three areas where we kind of see it the most are just in one's kind of personal feelings and kind of personal orientation to self, in relationships with other people, and in general kind of mental health. And so, the personal problems that can come about are things like emptiness, feeling inauthentic, feeling like you have to put up fronts, not being able to be your true self, stress from just feeling alone and not having a support network, and having to always pretend and perform. And then really getting into, over time, diminished self-awareness and less emotional intelligence from having to keep one's emotions hidden from the outside world. And as I've said, this isn't all men, but unfortunately this is lots of boys and men out there. Relationships can suffer if someone isn't seeking enough help and getting support. Higher divorce rates, feeling less intimately connected to loved ones, feeling less intimately connected to kids, having kids report, I really don't feel like I know my dad that well, or having men reflecting back on their childhoods, feeling like I never really knew my dad, which we hear. This is a big one, so anger and externalizing behaviors can become a big problem for boys and men when they keep stuff kind of repressed and hidden from other people. Challenges that they're facing can come out in these more externalizing ways. And then mental health. Substance abuse problems, heightened suicide rates, So, I mean, there are all sorts of rates out there that starting in adolescence, throughout the rest of their lives, boys and men commit. So they carry out suicide 4-to-1, 5-to-1. Some studies have shown 6-to-1, really suggesting that a lot of suffering is going on, where they're not receiving support. Lower life expectancy, not attending routine checkups, and then, you know, problems that we've been facing a lot in the US is school violence, school shootings, much higher levels of incarcerations for men. And when we think about school violence and school shootings, I mean, it's an unbelievable disparity in terms of the ratio of boys to girls who are committing these acts in the schools. You know, I mean, it's something like 48-to-2. I mean, very rarely does a girl or a woman carry out one of these acts. And then just all around mental and physical health. So these are some real life examples. I'm not going to go through each of these right now, but every once in a while, a famous man, all of a sudden, who seems like he's doing incredibly well, kills himself, has a drug overdose, right? And so these are very kind of popular, real examples of when men aren't getting the help they need, or boys. And then this is just a recap of everything that we've talked about, which is in the slides. So I want to really quickly end, because I have 2 minutes, which is exactly how long this short documentary is. Has anyone heard of this, The Mask You Live In? Okay, so I think you'll enjoy this, and this really sums up a lot of the points that I've been trying to make. And so this is just the trailer to the film.
Stop crying.
Stop with the tears.
Don't cry. Pick yourself up.
Stop with the emotion.
Don't be a pussy. Don't let nobody disrespect you.
Be cool and be kind of a dick.
Always keep your mouth shut.
Nobody likes a tattletale.
Bros come before hoes.
Don't let your woman run your life.
You bitch.
What a fag. Get laid. Do something.
Be a man.
Be a man.
Grow some balls.
The 3 most destructive words that every man receives when he's a boy is when he's told to be a man.
We've constructed an idea of masculinity in the United States that doesn't give young boys a way to feel secure in their masculinity, so we make them go prove it all the time.
Within their peer group culture, each of them is posturing based on how the other boys are posturing, and what they end up missing is what they each really want, which is just that closeness.
In good times, guys are like really close to each other, but when things get a little bit worse, you're on your own.
From middle school, I had 4 really close friends. Once I kind of went into high school, I struggle finding people I can talk to because I feel like I'm not supposed to get help.
Our kids get up every morning. They have to prepare their mask for how they're gonna walk to school. A lot of our students don't know how to take the mask off. What is it you don't let people see? Almost 90% of you have pain and anger on the back of that paper.
If you never cry, then you have all these feelings stuffed up inside of you, and then you can't get them out.
They really buy into a culture that doesn't value what we've feminized. If we're in a culture that doesn't value caring, doesn't value relationships, doesn't value empathy, you are going to have boys and girls, men and women go crazy.
I had anger issues in high school. I felt like an outcast.
I've been suspended at least once every year I was here.
We would just look for trouble and just like try to fight.
Boys are more likely to act, they're more likely to become aggressive. Most people miss that as depression, or see it as a conduct disorder, or just a bad kid.
I felt like just giving up on life. You know, I actually had suicide thoughts in my head at 6th grade.
I felt alone for a long time, and I actually thought about killing myself.
Whether it's homicidal violence or suicidal violence, people resort to such desperate behavior only when they are feeling shamed and humiliated, or feel they would be if they didn't prove that they were real men.
If you're told from day one, don't let nobody disrespect you, and this is the way you handle it as a man, respect is linked to violence.
If I can man up, why step down from that, you feel me?
It's like instinct.
So man up.
Man up.
Man up.
Man up.
Pull some fucking balls. Act like a man. Be a man.
Be a man.
For my kids, I was gonna end this hyper-masculine narrative here.
Okay, and then I just want to especially thank some of the members of our research group, Mike Gladys, who's the director, Josh Berger, who's one of my colleagues there, and here's a few references in the slides to have, and then there are lots of other references if people are curious about any specific stuff. So thank you for having me. This was really wonderful. Any questions, reflections, things people are curious about? Yeah.
Hi, Chris. It's very interesting because you weren't here this morning to listen to John MacDonald talking about the positive elements of masculinity.
Yep.
And the thing that struck me most with the presentation was actually seeing the film The Hangover up there, because I guess that's a good example of what John was talking about, that it's being presented in a very pejorative way. A lot of what takes place in that film in particular is about how the guys look after each other and care for each other in a whole range of situations. And I think we're missing a trick when we don't recognize those elements of masculinity.
I think that's a great point, yeah. So in The Hangover, there are misogynistic things that happen. There's a big focus on kind of substance abuse, kind of being these, they call them man-child, but then there are these positive bonding elements, and there are examples in there of men sharing some difficulties as they're kind of doing, these pretty extreme forms of bonding. So yeah, that's a great point. And I think one thing that comes to mind for me about whether it's male bonding or female bonding or just people bonding is which elements of that kind of really carry out across to humanity and are just kind of representative of people bonding with people and finding ways to connect.
But it's just a shame when it's always put across as male bonding is in some way wholly negative. I just think that's sad.
Yep, it's not, yeah. I think male bonding in a lot of ways gets a reputation for being fairly misogynistic and homophobic. And it certainly is those things in different contexts and for certain groups of boys and men, but then it can also be positive too. So yeah, that's a good point. Yeah?
Hi, thank you for this presentation. You were talking earlier about, we were talking about men as a group, but there are individual differences. And aligned with Steve's comment, it described men don't talk, but we heard about the man, the firefighter. He did talk to his wife. So is there any more examples that you have across your research of those exceptions that men go away from the I'm not talking to there's some context in which they feel safe to talk, to disclose, or to get engaged into positive health behaviors? Did you notice anything in your in men you met?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the Visible Men Project, which is where we were doing these interviews, there were men kind of in all different representations in terms of their communication and emotional styles. And we actually have a paper coming out on this in Gender and Society that's all about cloudy masculinity. And kind of the idea behind cloudy is really representing all of these different variations, and that masculinity is not one thing, and there's not one way that men do it. And in these interviews, we did see some men who kind of represented these more traditional norms that I've been talking about, but we also had men who kind of most of the times were far more complicated. So maybe went through a period in kind of middle age where I'm thinking of one example where this man was really shut down, didn't communicate with his wife, didn't communicate with his kids. It led to a divorce. And then later in his life, he started to open up a lot more. And he realized, you know what, that wasn't working for me, and would actually kind of identify that masculinity stuff that other guys do sometimes, I think is awful. And so he changed. So yeah, we saw a lot of nuances and a lot of kind of complicated ways that men do this stuff or resist it, which is kind of an important new area of research, is resistance to masculine norms, which we also see in boys and men. So, Yeah.
Yes. Yes, thanks very much indeed for your presentation. I wonder, one of the points that you sort of emphasized in an implicit manner was the role that play in not only norm enforcement, as you put it, but in those sort of very everyday forms of denying male emotion, right? So the little things like, like you say, suck it up, man up, really you're gonna go and lie down after your hard day, I deal with death all the time, come on, come and sit at the table. So is there a conversation, and this is it's a slightly controversial terrain, but is there a conversation that needs to happen around the role that women play in enforcing these norms as well? Because there's a way in which this is not a terrain that has been traversed in any sort of significant way by the literature, as far as I can gather. So what role does the young man's fear or the older man's fear of failing or seem to have failed at heterosexual masculinity play in all of this? And what role do women play in sometimes actively enforcing that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, and I think it's a line of research that has yet to be done in terms of what I've seen as well, and so maybe that's something that you can start for us. But I can tell you from the
Luckily,
boys,
I have tenure.
from the boys that I've talked to in the study that I mentioned, a lot of times boys would talk about this posturing and this policing of masculinity, and they would say, if it's done with a friend, if it's done with another boy I trust, it's not a big deal, it's just joking, we're doing it back and forth, they're still getting the messages, the masculinity messages out there, and they're still getting reinforced, but it's in a way that doesn't feel victimizing for them. And they would say, but the times it feels really bad is if a girl says it to me, because that feels like the ultimate threat, getting called out by a girl or a woman, and it happens from them too. And we saw the example of the mother saying to her son, right, there, big boys don't cry. That's a form of policing of masculinity right there. So yeah, so I think that needs to happen, and that's a great point. So thank you. Yeah.
Oh, there is a question just over there. Oh yeah? Okay, go. Ksenia.
Yep, and it's fluid and it's contextual, and that's a really important reminder. Yep.
We can.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've seen a little bit of that site, and I'd be curious to give you my card so we could maybe email a little bit about it. My sense of what sites like Man Therapy are doing is they're basically reinforcing some ways that dominant masculine norms can be problematic and can put men in boxes and can limit them in terms of social expression, self-expression. They don't acknowledge the ways that norms are socially constructed, which they are. When we talk about gender norms, we're talking about socially constructed behaviors versus sex is biological, right? But gender is social. So they don't recognize that. So I think for me, thinking about doing therapy with boys and men, it's complicated, and it really differs case by case. But as the therapist, wanting to go into that, understanding how someone might be socialized, understanding how that could lead to some resistance or ambivalence from them. And then hopefully as the therapist, finding ways to help them recognize how they've been limited in a way that feels safe and non-threatening. So.
If masculinity is so bad, how do you work with men to help them?
Yeah, well, so I would say, I don't have the answer to that, but the way that I work with boys and men really differs a lot depending on who the boy is and who the man is. And in some cases, you're working with a boy or a man where gender is a really big part of their struggle. You might have a veteran suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, who feels like he has to suck everything up and feels like, you know, his kind of body feeling out of control and these flashbacks that he's having and these nightmares are a form of weakness. And in that example, gender might be a big part of, and kind of adherence to these hegemonic, dominant masculine norms, the really extreme ones, might be a big part of what is keeping him from getting closer to recovery. And so in that case, you would need to find a way to work with it more. But I think patience is a big part of it. I think developing the alliance so that he trusts you before you start kind of raising questions for him that if you do it too early on in therapy are going to be too threatening. Right? So that's a case of where gender does play a role, but there are lots of cases of working with boys and men where they're doing okay and they're functioning well and they have good relationships and they have good friendships and they're intimately connected with their partners, and it doesn't play as much of a role. So it really just depends. For some men, this stuff can be really problematic and really lead to a lot of their suffering. And for other boys and men, it really doesn't, and it doesn't need to be addressed because they're either questioning it on their own, or as we know about hegemonic masculinity, right, which is this dominant kind of illusory form of masculinity, none of us can ever get there, right? It's unattainable. It's something that as a boy or man you're constantly striving for, but as a human being, it's impossible to fully manifest. And you know, I think plenty of boys and men kind of realize that and are able to see some of those ways that it's either not going to happen or it's just not a healthy way to be. So I don't know if that answered your very challenging question, which deserves a book. And I think there are some books out there on it. So
Because I think we can use masculinity as a strength, not just as a weakness or a problem.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, I think it could be a good debate because I think if it's just negative, just bad, we can't do a lot of things with masculinity.
Yep. Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think when you talk about traits like courage, bravery, kind of resilience in the face of adversity,
yes,
power, those are all very positive things. For me, those are all very positive things, whether you're a male or a female. So where it becomes problematic is when those get more associated on the male side of the equation. Because I think those are positive things for humans, whoever you are. So, yeah, it's a great point.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Great. Merci. Thank you.